So I feel obliged to start every presentation by just saying a little bit about who we are and what we do. But I think you all know IES. I think you probably wouldn't be here if you didn't. But as you know, we're a small but perfectly formed team working across employment skills and human resource management and practice. And over the last few years, obviously, inevitably, have been particularly focused on trying to support public policy commissioners, delivery organisations, and employers through what has been, the most fundamental, most significant changes we've seen in the labour market, certainly in my lifetime, and I think arguably in at least the last half century. Now, I think had we, casting our minds back 2 years ago, I think if we thought we'd be meeting in 2022 to talk about the future of work, I think many of us might have anticipated we'd be having a very different source of discussion to one we're having now. Back then we were anticipating the COVID-19 pandemic was going to lead to something like 4 million people unemployed, and I think we would have expected coming together that we would have been talking about how do we deal with the huge impacts of that crisis on communities, on people, and the scarring impacts in particular of long-term unemployment. But in fact, we're here dealing with, I think, two very different challenges instead, as unemployment has fallen back, and now on the latest forecast is heading for the lowest it's been in 50 years, thanks to our flexible labour markets, thanks to the plan for jobs, thanks to the job retention scheme, and thanks to the adaptability and the versatility of people and firms and communities. But as I say, while these forecasts have come down and down and down, and we're now heading for unemployment, which will be the lowest since at least the early 1970s, this is far from job done in the labour market. And I think we're now facing two really significant challenges. The first is a crisis of participation, where we've now got 600,000 fewer people in the labour force than we had before the pandemic began, and a crisis of recruitment, where really, I think for the first time in the 20 years, I'd say I've been working in this nearly 25 years working in this space, the top priority from every single firm, employer body we speak to is how do I keep people and how do I get people? And what's driving this? So this graph shows employment, unemployment, and economic inactivity. It's a smaller labour force overall, and it's also really worrying, concerning rises in economic inactivity, which you can see here on the right-hand side. And the most recent data on the far right bit is rising and rising and rising pretty relentlessly. And the monthly figures, this is quarterly averages are in blue, the monthly figures are in yellow, are even more concerning in many respects, suggesting that, let's see, it's quite noisy data, but suggesting that economic inactivity will keep going up and employment, far from levelling off, may start to edge down. And we've been talking about this idea of not just of there being fewer people in the labour force, but also that this is having lasting, but also that this is reversing a trend of rising participation. We've been talking about this really since last year, and we refined our estimates somewhat in the last couple of months. But the labour force has grown consistently since the mid-1990s, well, really since the early 1990s. The only time the labour force has shrunk in the last 30 or 40 years was in the late 80s, when public policy was quite deliberately trying to pension off older people, particularly older men, from public utilities and privatised industries. Now we've kind of inadvertently pensioned off, appear to be pensioning off a generation of older men and women from the labour force. And again, just to reiterate, this isn't just that participation, so participation is a measure of those in work or looking for work, so it includes unemployment. This isn't just that it's levelling off, it's that it now appears to be falling. There's 1.1 million fewer people than there would have been had the labour market continued on its pre-crisis trends. Key question for the future of work: is this going to recover? Is it going to start to reverse? The OBR are forecasting that in effect it will start to unwind. The OBR being the Office of Budget Responsibility, and we'll start to see this line go up. It won't go back onto the trend line it was on, but it will start to rise again. The latest data suggests that isn't happening, which is very concerning. Now, just unpacking economic inactivity a bit more, because I think this is really important, in particular when we're thinking about where are the kind of missing workers. Economic inactivity describes anybody who's out of work and not looking for work, and it's always a large group. It's always around 7 or 8 million people in working age aged under 65, and it's often because people are looking after their family, or because they're students, or because they're got long-term health conditions, or they've retired early, or they're just sitting out the labour market, particularly for older people. Now, what we've seen is kind of we've seen four trends, but three distinct phases here in the pandemic. The first was inevitably in the early lockdowns, huge rises in economic inactivity due to those lockdowns, people leaving work because their workplaces were closed or because there weren't jobs for them to go to, or they felt they weren't able to work, or indeed they might have been shielding. Luckily, the A-levels fiasco was a huge public policy success in that it opened the floodgates to university participation, and led to a really large increase in student numbers from autumn 2020, which is now, student numbers aren't falling back, but economic inactivity due to being a student is falling back because many of those students are getting jobs. So we might come back to that in a wee bit of time. But this third phase since early 2021 has been a really concerning, unprecedented actually, growth in inactivity due to ill health and early retirement. And the ill health inactivity has now grown at a faster rate in the last year than at any point since comparable records began in the early 1990s. So I think we can be fairly confident it's grown at a faster rate than at any point, basically ever. What's driving that? It's quite hard to tell at the moment. We'll be doing more work on that in the next few months. But it does appear that this is primarily been people exiting the labour force due to economic inactivity, and also sort of similar numbers coming back into work from inactivity than pre-pandemic, but that not rising as much as you might have expected it to do given the increases in those out of work. So it does look like this is people leaving work rather than just fewer people entering work who have long-term health conditions. Some speculation is could be COVID-19. I think also long COVID in effect. There could be an element of this. I suspect a lot of it is long-term mental health conditions and the sheer toll that the pandemic has taken over 2 years on many people, particularly people in sort of less secure work who may have been affected by lockdowns, and indeed older people, perhaps with chronic health conditions. The fourth trend here at the bottom, though, is really important. We've actually seen rising participation for women in particular, and fewer people out of the women under 50, and fewer people out of the labour force looking after their family and children. And again, that might be seen as a sort of as a consequence of COVID-19. And that might be specifically a consequence of things like the job retention scheme, moves to greater hybrid working, measures that have basically kept people attached to work or enable people to stay in work or return to work when previously they may not have done. Somewhat worrying, that does appear to be dropping off a bit in the most recent data. As things start to return to normal, so again, a question, how do we keep the benefits of some of the benefits of these new ways of working that we've discovered, the natural experiments of the last 2 years? How do we keep some of the benefits and manage the risks? It does appear that as we start to return to something more like normal activity in the labour market, we're starting to see those numbers start to rise again in terms of number of people who are off work, looking after family, looking after children, perhaps suggesting people aren't getting some of the flexibility they might need. This just illustrates a point about reasons for inactivity. That was showing, the previous graph showed changes, this shows levels. Economic inactivity due to long-term ill health, this is each of the last 3 years, is now the highest it's been since the since the early 2000s, and it's the most common reason now for being economically inactive. But really important to mention on this, which I mentioned already, is around age. And we're seeing in particular really significant rises in worklessness amongst older people. The pink line here, if you can see it, is people aged over 65. The light blue line is people aged 50 to 64. Young people go up and come down. Young people are starting to return to the labour force, particularly younger students, as firms recruit differently, look to fill in particular some of those temporary shorter term jobs with student workers. And a worrying trend here, actually, when you look at those bottom two lines, this graph used to say flat, I've now said broadly flat, because we are actually seeing some quite significant rises now, potentially significant rises here in economic inactivity amongst people in their 30s and 40s. And some of this does appear to be being driven in particular by ill health. Now, these really large rises in inactivity amongst older workers, I'd really commend some of the work that the ONS have done, diving deeper on this, some survey analysis that they published, bespoke survey that they ran around what's happening around older people's experiences of work and reasons for leaving the labour force. Early retirement is the most common reason why people leave, but it's really important to note for people in their 50s in particular, it's still a minority of people who've said that they've retired. Most people do not consider themselves to have retired. They said they've retired because their job didn't work out, they couldn't get the flexibility they wanted, because of their health, for example, and because of other factors. And the majority of people in their 50s have said they would come back to work in the right circumstances. And the most common reason why people would consider coming back to work is for the right job. It's not pay. Pay is the second most common. So it's important to note, it's not all about pay. The reasons why people in their, these sorts of reasons that people in their 50s are giving about why they would come back to work, what would attract them back to work, is a job that they would enjoy, a job that suited their lifestyle, a job that matched their skills, that would be rewarding, that would be worthwhile, and yes, that would pay well. I think for all of us, as we're looking at where that potential labour force is, how we understand the needs and aspirations and capabilities of older people is going to be fundamentally important. And also, of course, understanding where we might need to think about support needs in work, and really importantly, how we think about job design, how we think about the language we use in recruitment, and indeed how we run recruitment and how we support people in the workplace. That missing million, then, these graphs, I think these graphs got slightly disordered, which is my mistake. That missing million that I showed earlier, around 3/5 of that is explained by older people, people over 50. And that's a pretty even split, actually, between fewer older women in the labour force and fewer older men. And we've tried to, in this analysis, account for the effect that raising state pension age has had, because that did raise participation for older women. And even allowing for that, there's still these really significant deficits in participation for older workers. This is mainly, just to reiterate, this has mainly been driven by people leaving work at the moment, people leaving work during the pandemic, and in particular, I think people leaving work after furlough, rather than fewer people entering work. But I think we are now starting to see some of these impacts of people drifting into longer term worklessness and then not returning to work and not looking to return. At the same time, really importantly, you would expect as the labour market tightens, and it is tightening, that we would see employment gaps start to narrow for disadvantaged groups. And again, this shows year by year by year the difference between the employment rate for the group identified here, the disadvantaged group identified here, and the employment rate for people who don't have that labour market disadvantage. One point stands out here, that disabled people are hugely disadvantaged in the labour market, 25 percentage points less likely to be in work. To put that another way, they're about 2.5 times more likely to be out of work as non-disabled people. But worryingly, that employment gap has risen in the last 3 years. It's also rising for older people from a lower base. It had been narrowing over decades. For ethnic minority groups, we did see some improvement in the first year of the pandemic, which appears to have levelled off. And somewhat surprisingly, for young people not in full-time education, the gap persists. It got worse initially in the pandemic, but the gap does persist, even though, so young people who are not in education are still less likely to be in work than people who are not, the people who aren't young, the older people. And that historically has not always been the case. That going back 15, 20 years was a positive line rather than negative one. So young people still, young people outside education still appear to be quite significantly disadvantaged. And look, as you all know, this has happened in spite of record levels of vacancies, well above pre-crisis, 50% higher than pre-pandemic levels, which already were the highest we'd ever seen. Vacancies are above pandemic levels in every single industry that the ONS collects data on. This shows pre-pandemic a year, the most recent data in blue, pre-pandemic data in black, and the previous quarter's data in yellow, just so we can see the most recent data compared to the data a quarter previously, where the most recent sort of changes have been. And this is really across the economy, and it's been driven by shortages, in particular in hospitality, which is due to sort of structural problems there, I think, around recruitment shortages and turnover. Health and human services, health and social work, which is not unexpected, clearly, but also really significant growth in professional jobs, vacancies in professional jobs, and quite a strong recovery in retail, or indeed high turnover, actually as much as anything in retail driving this too. And really importantly, high vacancies is a positive in many respects for the labour market. Clearly, it implies high demand, but really importantly, this is being driven, it's being fueled by record job-to-job moves, and this is where the sort of great resignation does appear to be happening. It's people leaving jobs and starting new ones. We've got the highest rate of job-to-job moves that we've had. Again, since records began, although we've only collected data on this for about 20 years, and the highest level of job-to-job moves. 1 million people changed jobs, which is a phenomenal figure in the single quarter of October to December 2021. And of course, with all these people moving, that means firms are struggling to fill their jobs, and with a smaller labour force, that means they're struggling even more to fill their jobs. And of course, with lower migration, particularly limiting labour supply and lower skilled work, firms are, this is an acute, what began as a series of acute challenges related to the pandemic have now become really chronic ones. Put this all together, on one important measure of labour market tightness, the number of unemployed people per vacancy, we have the tightest labour market that we've ever had. We've now literally got as many vacancies as there are unemployed people. If you go back to the height of the pandemic, there were 4 vacancies, there were more than 4 unemployed people for every vacancy. You go back previous crises, those figures could be above 10, could be above 15. It's never been a tougher time, a harder time to fill jobs. It's never been, if you're a job seeker, a better time to be looking for a job, which makes it all the more challenging that so few people are looking for work. Now, one thing, if you follow some of the, if you pay only cursory attention to some of the coverage of labour market data, you might then think, why isn't this feeding through into pay? And the short answer is it is. So pay growth is really high by historic standards, by recent historic standards. If you leave out this really big peak before the red line, the red circle here, which is because of compositional changes, because of how furlough affected pay, it cut pay one year, raised it back up again the next year. So if you leave that out, because these are all year-on-year comparisons. Right now, if you look at regular pay and total pay, including bonuses, the total pay is a dotted line here, and regular pay is the solid line. In nominal terms, regular pay growth is just nudging 4%. Total pay growth is about 5%. It's not been this high since before the Great Recession, but it just can't keep up with rocketing inflation, which is what's pushing real pay growth in yellow negative. If it wasn't for inflation, clearly, that's a sort of ridiculous thing to say, but because that's the world we're living in. But if it wasn't for these pressures we're seeing on rising prices, I think we would be having a very different debate, which is about an overheating labour market, but also recoveries in really welcome recoveries in nominal pay. As it is, thank goodness nominal pay is helping to cushion the blow of high inflation, even if it's not cushioning it completely. And this I just won't have time to do justice to, but it'll be in the pack. I just did this yesterday because I wanted to sort of illustrate, I try to understand a bit better how vacancies and pay may be interrelated. So if you imagine just basically, the averages here in the dotted lines, but this shows in each sort of quadrant, high vacancy growth, high wage growth in the top right, high vacancy growth, low wage growth in the bottom right, and low vacancy growth is on the left-hand side with high wages in the top and low wages in the bottom. A few things leap out here. One is hospitality, accommodation and food services does appear to be sort of obeying the laws of physics, as it were. It's got really, really high vacancies, and pay is rocketing to keep up, running at about 12% pay growth a year. But some of these others, but more importantly, above that line on the pay growth line is basically pretty much the entirety of private sector service industries. Pretty much all of them are doing well on pay growth. Under the line, you've got basically the public sector, unsurprisingly, some of which is now a bit more subdued on vacancy growth, partly because a year ago there was a lot of vacancies in those industries in response to COVID, and it slowed down a little bit, but also down there, construction, manufacturing, and arts, entertainment and recreation taking a real hammering, really, really high demand, but also pay falling in nominal terms, so falling really significantly in real terms. So there's an issue with this data. I was the first sort of stab yesterday, and we'll do more work on this. But it does point to some of these challenges, particularly between our public sector and private sector pay, but also around how industries are trying to respond. Now, more positively, though, we are seeing growth, quite significant growth overall, in higher skilled work. So one of the things that we do miss when we look at turnover in vacancies, and this gets to the heart of kind of the future of work as well, we look at turnover in vacancies, is we tend to see a lot of the churn. We see the legs kicking rather than necessarily the swan. That's a terrible analogy because the swans don't really grow, do they? But the point is the labour market overall, actually, the growth in the labour market overall is being driven by higher skilled work, even though the churn, the really significant vacancy growth that, and the IFS pointed this last week, is disproportionately accounted for by lower pay, lower skilled work. So if you look at this on the occupational codes, which are labelled 1 to 9, we see here higher skilled work, which is typically 1 to 3. Although managers, directors and senior officials has fallen somewhat, I think this is mainly explained by older men pensioning themselves off through furlough and self-employed income support scheme during the pandemic. But professional occupations and associate professional occupations are now a larger share, and quite a significantly larger share, of total employment than they were before the pandemic. And it is skilled trades, and it is lower skilled elementary work in particular, numbers 8 and 9, which are falling as a share of employment. And these are long-running trends, actually. The long-running trend has been to more higher skilled and less lower skilled work, despite the sort of narrative about growth in low skilled, low paid employment. And that will continue, but it's been clearly accelerated by the pandemic. And you can see that even more clearly here. I've done this by gender as well, just because it's interesting. When you get right down to individual occupations at a 3-digit occupation code, the main thing here to look at is the numbers. Anything that begins with a 1, 2, 3 is relatively higher skilled, 4, 2 to some extent, and then the things that begin 7, 8 and 9 are relatively lower skilled. And it's higher skilled work for the most part that's driving this really significant growth, particularly kind of IT and communications related and business and administrative work and government work and so on. Number 9 here, elementary process plant occupations, is industrial cleaning, very clearly kind of pandemic related work. And the industries that are falling are predominantly lower skilled work. This though, so cleaning again, other elementary services being hospitality, mainly bar work, but that's starting to recover. And you can see here quite significant falls in some of these, as I say, some of these category 1 managers and directors points. So the point I was making glibly earlier about people pensioning themselves off, you can actually see it here. So you see the 125, 112, 113, virtually all men, virtually all blue, and managers and directors who've left the labour force. This though does really point to, I think, like this overall story of sort of change in the labour force points to that this isn't just a labour shortages issue. This is a skills mismatch issue as well. And so how people will not transition from sort of skilled trades into associate professional jobs without the right kind of support, and many of them may not do it at all. People won't transition from domestic cleaning into industrial cleaning, even though we might want them to, without some retraining, without some help with finding that right job, making those right connections. So it isn't just about labour shortages, it's also about how the system can better support people to make transitions between industries, as we know. And this is a point that the REC in particular have really emphasised around this being a labour and a skills crisis in their work. Now, finally, I just want to make a point, and I'll wrap up with some thoughts about kind of where we go from here. Finally, for those who are in employment, this labour crisis, this recruitment crisis, this participation crisis is also fueling overwork. We're seeing a really significant rise in overemployment, which is people who are working longer hours than they would want to, and would want to work fewer hours and also take less pay. That's the yellow line. This is now getting back up towards basically the highest, close to the highest it's been. The highest was immediately pre-pandemic. This will keep rising. But underemployment, people who've got fewer hours than they want, is actually down to the lowest it's been since before the financial crisis. So we are seeing this adjustment in working hours. A lot of this, I think, is pandemic related as well. It'll be in health services, but a lot of it will be in hospitality. It'll be in other industries that are struggling to recruit. And really importantly, I really recommend work the colleagues have done here around the Work After Lockdown project. The broader changes in how we work, and we'll talk about hybrid work later. Recording in progress. Oh, there we go. We'll talk about hybrid work later in the session. Our Work After Lockdown interim report pointed to some really significant concerns around the impacts of home working, but also obviously benefits for people. The final report goes into a lot more detail on this, and some of these concerns around well-being in particular are appearing to have improved. People are starting to find the right balance, but there are really significant risks and impacts here around work intensification, around lack of social contact and opportunities to network and so on, and from the job learning, fatigue, and risks that people are leaving the labour force, as well as these really significant gains. And how we make more of those gains and minimise some of those losses is going to be I think one of the defining challenges for many of us. And how we do that in particular in workplace, address some of the sort of equity concerns that are in workplaces, larger workplaces where people people may not be able to work from home, or some people may, and where people may need different kinds of flexibility and different kinds of support in work. I think are going to define how we address some of these labour market challenges and these people challenges going forward over the coming years. So look, this is a really different crisis to one we expected. And it's one that it's a recruitment and a participation crisis now. It's also one, I think, that risks being a kind of a well-being and a satisfaction and a retention crisis for people in work. It does appear to be feeding through into into more hours and some improvements in working conditions, but also concerns around overwork, work intensification, and that people are more disadvantaged, maybe faring less well. So we think there's a ton of priorities here for public policy. We're not really here to talk about kind of public policy, but I do think, I was saying this yesterday at an event when we launched work with TimeWise looking at flexible work, that we do need, I think, to fundamentally reimagine our approach to employment services and employment support. We need to have a dual focus on individuals and on employers, far greater focus on how we better support and engage with employers and how we better address sort of labour market efficiency and labour market equity challenges. But we also, for firms, I think, things that were previously seen as part of the problem around greater flexibility at work, around support for disadvantaged groups, around how we better how we better design jobs, how we support people in work, I think are now becoming part of the solution to these recruitment and participation challenges. There's never been a clearer case and a bit more of an imperative to address these problems and to address them better. And we are seeing more firms doing this, but I think I think we all but at the moment I think doing it often in isolation and in a way where I think we can do far better around how we can support that, how we can better engage with how we can better design work, how we can better support people who are out of work, support people who are in work to stay in work and also to widen access to the labour market. So over to you. I think there's never a better time, I think, to be having these conversations about the future of work. We've come through kind of 2 years of turmoil and upheaval in the labour market. But right now, I think some of the challenges we're facing are ones that are really shining a light on some structural challenges and structural problems in our labour force that we've had actually for decades. But it's incumbent on us now to try to address, particularly around how we can make work better, how we can improve job design, how we can support better flexible working, how we can improve how we recruit, how we retain, how we support workers. And critically importantly, I think how government, employers and communities can work better together to raise participation, better align support, to help to make work better and to meet these future challenges too, as the labour market continues to evolve. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Tony. Fascinating. I know it's caused a flood of questions in the chat. I'm not sure we're going to have time to get to all of them, but we'll pick a couple up. There's a couple I wanted to pick out. And then perhaps if you get a chance, you can have a look at some of the others. Just to reassure people, we are sharing the slides because I know there was a wealth of quality graphs and pictures that you may want to use. We will be sharing the outputs from this session. So there's one question here from Annie. Is there any information about what's going on with job insecurity? Any notable changes around kind of precarious contracts, things like 0 hours? Yeah, so 0 hours contracts rose and then fell a bit. And then in the most recent data, I'm not actually sure whether it went up or down, but I remember when it will be coming out, the new data coming out in a couple of weeks. It wasn't remarkable enough to put it in our briefing. So I will have a look again when the new data comes out in a few weeks' time. The one thing I'd say though, so temporary employment is up quite a bit on what it was pre-pandemic, but it's still relatively low compared to what we've seen in previous recessions. But it's quite hard to interpret some of this data because we've seen a massive fall in self-employment. Self-employment's down by like 800,000. And self-employment is often very insecure. It's also work that people really enjoy. Like people have higher job satisfaction. Self-employed people have much higher job satisfaction than employees. But so part of this has been actually a classification change. People who are previously self-employed now coming onto payrolls through IR35 in particular. Part of it is people who might describe themselves as self-employed now describe themselves as employees. And actually, quite a few of them will be on temporary contracts, or they may be on 0 hours contracts. So there's some compositional things going on here too. Like the growth in temporary employment is a fraction of the fall in self-employment. So I think overall insecurity, actually rising insecurity, is not particularly a feature of this crisis, which again you wouldn't really get from some of the more hysterical coverage of what's going on. For the most part, I think firms are trying to make jobs more secure to keep people in work. You talked a little bit about skills, so I wondered if you had a comment on kind of should public policy support transitions, particularly in low skill sector, given kind of where we know some of the growth is coming in the future in jobs? Yes,
And I really worry in public policy around skills that we've got a kind of a Model T Ford problem here, that you can have any skill support you want as long as it's an apprenticeship. And for most firms, like, an apprenticeship is not going to be the answer to their specific problem, let alone to the entirety of their labour market and reskilling problems. So the government said they're going to look again at this. I'm nervous about kind of training levies generally, because there's risks of like unintended consequences of distorting the market, blah, 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 that, you know, firms who do this already will just offset that investment against the levy. Firms that don't do it will either just suck it up as a business cost, or they'll do the bare minimum. But we definitely need something. I just think, you know, there's such a market failure here. There's a case for kind of public investment. We should view this as capital investment, so outside the normal sort of borrowing rules, because it delivers a return. And I think we should just be looking at how we can have better and well-designed sort of workplace training to try and support those transitions. And that critically means, I see Wendy's on, so I must make this point, that critically means we also need to invest in our careers, services and systems, particularly in later life. Because right now, if you're looking to make a transition, or indeed if you're being forced to make a transition, where do you go? And it's heartbreaking when I get notes. If I get quoted on something, anything on the BBC, basically, if I get quoted on it, I'll get emails from people. Overwhelmingly, they're from older people, particularly older men, saying, where do I go? What do I do? You know, I'm not on benefit. Job Centre Plus won't help me. What do I do? And it's like, well, okay, here's the phone number for the National Career Service. That's basically the extent of it. So how we support that, how we help people with understanding their capabilities, their skills, and how they make transitions is super important as well.
Lovely. I'll take one final one. Just whether you'd got any data or information around kind of in-work poverty. I know it's not touched on so much, but there's been a couple of questions around that issue, and obviously with growing cost of living. Yeah,
and I'll take perhaps a couple of these quick points here in the chat as well. So yes, in-work poverty has been a really important feature of the last couple of years. There's now more people in poverty in working households than there are in non-working households, kind of the first time ever, I think. And you know, as pay falls behind inflation yet again, we're going to see in-work poverty rise, particularly because, you know, the rise in benefits and getting on behalf of all people who are on benefits are in work. The rise in benefits is like 3% this year, which is a shocking, appalling sort of abdication of our sort of responsibility to the poorest in society. That's going to get even worse. The only thing I'd say is out of work poverty is where people in severe poverty are out of work. And people in destitution are out of work. So I think our biggest challenges are still, you know, part of the pitch, I suppose, around why it's so important to raise participation is because if you're out of work, you may be poor, but at least you're in work and you'll be shielded to some extent from those impacts. Steve makes a point about productivity. I think we will see productivity is already improving, and I think we will see that continue to improve. And I think the hope is that will be in a good way, because firms are investing more in the things that are productivity enhancing, and management, good quality management and line management is particularly important in that. My worry is, you know, inevitably, because we're not very good at business to business support, that actually, you know, this may not be, you know, we'll be finding our way on this, and we could be doing it better, I think. There's also just another point in here, which I'll just see if I can find, which I just wanted to pick up on, was around self-employment and 50 plus. I think it's a really, really important point from Mary Bright. Definitely, part of what we're seeing here is with older people has been these big falls in self-employment, and showing actually how precarious self-employment can be for people over 50. And many of those people actually haven't been in the sort of the traditional labour market for decades, let alone for years. And so again, how we reach and support people and how we open up those opportunities is really, really important. And for those of you who are in the sort of public policy space, as it were, you know, the overwhelming focus on Job Centre Plus as a means for delivering employment support is deeply unhelpful in this context. Like, you know, we need to be delivering support through a much broader range of provision, and we need to have employment support where people go, not expect that people to come to job centres to access it. Huge challenges, but also I do think, you know, fantastic opportunities. And one of the things for us that we're really keen to do over the next year or so is to try to articulate what that kind of reimagined public employment or broader like employment space would look like. What would a Labour ministry and a true sort of labour exchange public employment service be delivering in a modern economy. Because I think this is, we've got a chance now, and particularly with the next election, to after the next election, with a new parliament, I think, for fundamental reform here.